We have just experienced a second prisoner exchange that President Volodymyr Zelensky has organized. We're probably likely to see some more in the early new year. This second one also had a similar controversy to the first prisoner exchange in November. And that was to do with the fact that on both occasions, Zelensky claimed that they would not have gone ahead if certain individuals were not included on the Ukrainian side, that we would give over to the Russians. In the first case, this was a Mr. Tsemach, who was implicated in the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner MH17 in July 2014. He would have been a key witness in the trial, which is beginning in The Hague in the Netherlands in March of 2020. Even though the Russians have claimed to this day that they were not involved in the shooting down of the airliner, for some reason they desperately wanted him to come back. This was particularly irritating because he was captured behind separatist lines by a security service of Ukraine special forces unit that went undercover. One member of that unit was killed, one was wounded. So there was a high price to pay for his capture, and giving him over, I think, was a mistake. Secondly, what we have included in the second transfer, again, Russians have claimed there was nothing to do with the shootings on the Euromaidan, but for some reason they desperately wanted two groups of people. One was a very small number of people involved in terrorist attacks, which took place in eastern and southern Ukraine, particularly Kharkiv and Odessa, in 2015, late 2014, 2015. These terrorist attacks were quite numerous. I wrote about them at the time. And it was obvious that they were being organized by Russia outside of the Donbass fighting zone. And they were targeting meeting places for volunteers, helping the Ukrainian soldiers, officers of volunteers, and various pro-Ukrainian protests. One in Kharkiv in particular was a bomb placed during a protest rally, which killed some people. The second group, which was included, were 5 Berkut officers. Berkut was a special forces unit in the Ukrainian police, which had snipers, and they were allegedly behind the killing of 48 of the 110 Heavenly 100 who were murdered on the Euromaidan. Now, this is also particularly irritating because President Petro Poroshenko was often criticized for not doing enough in bringing to justice those involved in the terrible repressions on the Euromaidan. It wasn't just a case of 110 people being killed. There was over 1,000 injured and wounded in various ways, tortured. And yet some people had been put in jail, and now Zelensky's released these and they've gone to Russia, where, of course, they both deny that they were involved in the murders, and they are heroes. Just like the Berkut officers who went to the Crimea in March 2014, they were welcomed as heroes for killing fascists on the Euromaidan. So in both cases, Zelensky claims that the prisoner exchanges would not have gone ahead if he had not included Tsemach in the first case, and then these Berkut officers and these pro-Russian terrorists in the second one. I think that's a false claim on his part, and I think Zelensky has a problem in not being truthful enough and not being honest enough with Ukrainian citizens who are very good at reading between the lines. These are not Russians who have lived for 20 plus years in an autocratic system with a state-controlled media. Ukraine has a free media, has free discussions, has a very vibrant television and online presence, and therefore you can't hoodwink Ukrainians. And I think here Zelensky is fooling himself if he thinks he can get away with saying such lies. One way that you can counter this is by the fact that Zelensky did not begin prisoner exchanges. These were taking place throughout Poroshenko's presidency. throughout Poroshenko's presidency, something in the region of 3,000 people were released in a variety of different prisoner exchanges. This was a reason why he claimed, President Poroshenko claimed, he had to keep Viktor Medvedchuk on board in this whole elaborate negotiating process, because Medvedchuk was very much involved in these prisoner exchanges. Medvedchuk being somebody high up in the pro-Russian opposition platform, and of course his daughter has Putin as her godfather. So obviously Putin's man in Ukraine. Now, under Poroshenko, he said that the same kind of demands were made to him about including specific people the Russians wanted back in these prisoner exchanges. Poroshenko said he always refused, and yet the prisoner exchanges went ahead. So for Zelensky now to claim otherwise, that they wouldn't have gone ahead if he had not included these, is actually disingenuous. It's not true. I think the reasons for them going ahead are in other areas. He campaigned strongly, this is Zelensky, on the question that he's going to bring peace to Ukraine. He's not going to bring peace to Ukraine unless he literally puts his hands up in the air and surrenders. And he can't do that, for obvious reasons. He wouldn't remain in power for long if he did. Zerkalo, the weekly Ukrainian newspaper, quoted him as saying in the Paris Normandy format summit just a few weeks ago that Mrs. Zelensky saying that if he tried to change the Ukrainian constitution to bring in this special status for the two separatist regions, that there would be a revolution in Ukraine. So Zelensky is fully aware of what he can and can't do. Now, because he realizes now, I think, after the mass protests against capitulation, which began sort of in September, October, and because of the negotiations which didn't lead to anything concrete in Paris, that he realizes, I think, I hope, that there isn't really a possibility of a breakthrough in peace in the Donbass. What the Russians are demanding is simply too much, and we are back to the same problem we had under Poroshenko of what comes first. Is it politics comes first, which is what the Russians want, elections and changing the constitution, or is it security first? Giving the border back to Ukraine, demilitarization and such like. The difficulties of doing those things are simply too big, and the demands on the Russian side, which is not willing to compromise, are simply too great, and therefore there isn't a possibility of peace. Just even the question of demilitarizing 35,000 separatist forces created by Russia with heavy weapons would be a nightmare if it was attempted. It took a lot of effort to demilitarize 2,000 terrorists in Northern Ireland after the Good Friday Agreement in 1999, and they just had light weaponry. So 35,000, and remember that Putin claims these are not Russian forces, that these are locals. So what he wants is not demilitarization, but that these 35,000 separatist forces become a kind of a new militia, new local protective force when these regions get their special status in the Ukrainian constitution. Now, there's no way a Ukrainian president can agree to that, because that would create, in effect, a pro-Russian army, pro-Russian Trojan horse inside Ukraine. So if peace is not possible, the only thing that Zelensky can do is prisoner exchanges. And hence, he's trying to do them very quickly, and hence he's meeting all the Russian demands, and he's trying to do as many as he can. So that's the real reason why he's willing to go ahead with Russian demands of who's to be included in the prisoner exchanges. What we don't understand as well is why the numbers are odd. Why did Ukraine only get back 74 people, soldiers, journalists, and others, whereas we gave the Russians 124? Why the difference in numbers? Again, rather odd. But these giving back individuals who were charged with murder on the Euromaidan has a broader impact than just the human factor, which we all know is important. Of course, people want to have their loved ones back from captivity, in some cases 3-4 years of captivity. But there is an impact on the rule of law. If Zelensky cannot bring peace to Ukraine, bring peace to Donbass, not because he doesn't want to, he does, Zelensky, but it's simply impossible because you're dealing with Putin. So if he can't do that, then his main goals, his main ability to get his name, get his presidency to be a success is going to be in the field of fighting corruption and the rule of law. Now, despite what everybody says, there was some progress under Poroshenko on that. At the very least, all of these new institutions like the National Bureau Against Corruption, the Anti-Corruption Court, were all created under Poroshenko. They now have to produce results. By basically undermining the criminal investigations and the sense of justice being served on the question of Euromaidan murders, by giving over these snipers, these murderers, to Russia, that is undermining Zelensky's own agenda of allegedly improving the rule of law. Now, that is going to be a key area. I mean, his presidency is going to, I think, succeed or fail, not on the question of peace in the Donbass, because nobody's going to blame him for that. They're going to blame Putin. Ukrainian opinion polls blame Russia for those. Most Ukrainians, something like 70+%, believe that they can't really be peace in Ukraine whilst Putin's in power. What they neglect to mention is that Putin's in power forever, as long as he lives. He's not going to leave power in 2024. So they're not going to blame Zelensky for that. But if he doesn't have success in the rule of law, justice, fighting corruption, making sure elites are not above the law, which they always have been in Ukraine, then that's where he's going to fail. And the handing over these Berkut snipers doesn't help him in that respect. In particular, because there is still the shadow hanging over him all the time of Igor Kolomoisky. And that shadow won't go away. Just a week ago, Radio Svoboda, the Ukrainian language service of Radio Liberty, published a video blog about the chief of staff, Mr. Bogdan, meeting Kolomoisky secretly in a restaurant in Kiev. Why? Why was he doing this secretly? What's the purpose of this? We know that Kolomoisky wants his cash cows back, particularly Privatbank and also Ukranafta, the state oil refining company. But even irrespective of that, there are Western demands, including from the IMF, that people like Kolomoisky and others who are involved in money laundering billions through Ukrainian banks should be put on trial. So Zelensky already has an uphill battle dealing with the Kolomoisky problem he has, because if he can't put others in jail. If he puts just others in jail and not Kolomoisky, that will be seen to be selective use of justice. So I think Zelensky, we hope there will be more prisoner exchanges. Nobody's against them, but that he should stand up to Russian demands like Poroshenko did, and not send over to Russia any more people which Russia obviously wants, because those people could be either important in trials in Western Europe, and that trial beginning in March will have a major impact on Western European attitudes towards Russia, towards Putin. It'll reinforce the ongoing European Union votes every 6 months to continue sanctions against Russia, because there's no question that Russia was involved in the shooting down of MH17. But also there are probably other people still in Ukrainian jails who are involved in various atrocities and human rights abuses on the Euromaidan. We hope they're not going to be included in future prisoner exchanges. So looking ahead, Zelensky has to, I think, and he is maybe growing less naive about Russia. A big wake-up call with the protests throughout Ukraine. These are not protests just, as they would have been maybe 20 years ago, just West Ukrainians. In early November, I was in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, now called Dnipro, and gave a presentation of my book, Putin's War Against Ukraine, at the Atom Museum, the only museum of the Ukrainian war in Ukraine. And I'm telling you, this city is very patriotic, Dnipro, and it has also a headquarters against capitulation. So it's even Eastern Ukrainians. I think Zelensky's woken up to that factor, and maybe it's coming to dawn on him that he can't bring peace. But we all hope that he will bring success in the other area, which is rule of law, fighting corruption, and ensuring that elites are no longer standing above the law. But for him to do that, he needs to be more honest, no longer opaque with Ukrainian citizens and voters, and he needs to stand up to Putin. And one example of that, where he needs to stand up, is not to stay quiet when at the press conference in Paris, Putin began complaining about discrimination of Russian speakers, which is obviously ridiculous when he's standing next to a Russian speaker, Zelensky, who's of Jewish background. And he became elected in Ukraine, and there wasn't one whisper of anti-Semitism during the Ukrainian elections. So he needs to stand up and say, firstly, there is no discrimination of Russian speakers in Ukraine. And secondly, and most importantly, the real discrimination is of Ukrainians and Tatars in Russian-occupied Crimea and in Russian-occupied Donbass. And let's not forget, the second largest minority in Russia are Ukrainians, and they have no rights. So it's time that Zelensky, he talked during his election campaign of taking the propaganda battle back to the Russians. Well, this would be a good way of doing that. So hopefully he'll grow a stronger backbone and on the one hand be more honest to Ukrainians, and on the other hand stand up to Putin. So yes, prison exchanges should go ahead, but no more people should be given over, such as Semach and the Berkut murderers. Thank you.